Retirement had always seemed like a distant dream during my working years, but at 62, I found myself in the fortunate position of being able to step back from the corporate world and enjoy a quieter life. I had spent 3 decades in construction management, dealing with deadlines, budgets, and the constant stress of keeping projects on track. When I finally had the opportunity to buy a small house in the countryside, far from the noise and chaos of city life, it felt like winning the lottery. My new home sat on several acres of land in a rural area where neighbors were measured in half miles rather than fence lines. The isolation was exactly what I had been craving after years of crowded offices and traffic jams. I had a few neighbors scattered around the area, good people who would wave when they passed by and occasionally stop to chat about the weather or local news, but for the most part, I was blissfully alone with my thoughts and my simple daily routines. The house itself was modest but comfortable, with 2 bedrooms, a cozy living room, and a kitchen that looked out over the expansive fields that surrounded my property. I had a workshop in the basement where I could tinker with woodworking projects, a small garden where I grew vegetables for my own table, and a storage shed out back where I kept my lawnmowers and various tools. I wasn't completely retired, not yet anyway. A few months out of each year, I would take on contracting work for old colleagues who needed an extra hand on their projects. It kept me busy and brought in some additional income, but more importantly, it kept my skills sharp and gave me a sense of purpose. The rest of the year was mine to spend as I pleased, reading books I had never had time for, taking long walks through the countryside, and simply enjoying the peace and quiet that had been so absent from my earlier life. Late fall was my favorite time of year in my new home. The summer heat had broken, the leaves were turning brilliant colors, and there was a crispness in the air that made everything feel fresh and clean. It was during this season that I spent most of my time preparing for winter, bringing in tools and equipment from the yard, checking the heating system, and making sure everything was secure before the harsh weather arrived. On this particular day, I had been working outside since early morning, gathering up all the equipment I had used during the summer months. Lawnmowers, hedge trimmers, hand tools, and various pieces of machinery that had been scattered around my property needed to be cleaned, organized, and stored in the shed for the winter. It was satisfying work, the kind of physical labor that felt productive and worthwhile. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink lower in the sky when I noticed something unusual. A man was walking along the road that connected to my driveway, moving at a steady pace but seeming to have no particular destination in mind. He carried nothing with him, no backpack or hiking gear, which struck me as odd given the remote location of my property. This road was essentially a dead end, serving only the handful of houses scattered throughout the area. The nearest town was at least 4 hours away on foot, and there were no hiking trails or tourist attractions that would bring casual visitors to this area. For someone to be walking along this road without any equipment or supplies was unusual enough to catch my attention. I watched him until he disappeared from view, continuing down the road past my house. I looked in both directions but saw no abandoned car or any indication of how he might have gotten to this remote area. It was puzzling, but not necessarily alarming. Perhaps he was visiting one of my neighbors, or maybe he was a local resident I simply hadn't met yet. I put the incident out of my mind and continued with my work, determined to finish storing all my equipment before dark. The physical labor felt good after months of mostly sedentary activities, and I was enjoying the simple satisfaction of completing a necessary task. By the time I finished loading the last of my tools into the shed, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. I headed back to the house, looking forward to a hot shower and a quiet evening. I had planned to make myself a simple dinner and spend the evening reading a book I had been working my way through. These quiet evenings had become one of my favorite parts of retirement, a luxury I had never been able to afford during my working years when evenings were filled with paperwork, phone calls, and preparations for the next day's responsibilities. I was sitting at my kitchen table, enjoying a home-cooked meal and looking out at the darkening fields through my window, when a sudden sound made me jump. It was a loud thud, like something heavy hitting wood, and it seemed to come from the direction of my storage shed. I got up from the table and looked out the window toward the shed. In the fading light, I could see that the door was standing wide open, swaying slightly in the evening breeze. That was strange. I distinctly remembered closing and latching that door after I finished storing my equipment. It was an old door, and the latch sometimes stuck, but I had made sure it was properly secured before I came inside. My first thought was that the wind might have blown it open, but the evening was relatively calm, with only a gentle breeze that didn't seem strong enough to force open a latched door. It was also possible that an animal might have somehow gotten into the shed, though I couldn't imagine how or why a wild animal would be able to open a latched door. I knew I had to go out and check on the situation. Even if it was just the wind or a harmless animal, I couldn't leave the shed door standing open all night. All of my expensive equipment was stored in there, and I couldn't risk having it damaged by weather or stolen by someone who might happen to pass by. I grabbed my rifle from the gun cabinet, more out of habit than any real expectation of danger. Living alone in a rural area, I had learned to be prepared for various situations, from wild animals that might threaten my garden to the remote possibility of encountering someone with ill intentions. The rifle was a tool, like a flashlight or a first aid kit, something I hoped I would never need but wanted to have available just in case. The walk from my house to the shed felt longer than usual in the gathering darkness. I moved carefully, listening for any sounds that might indicate what had caused the door to open. The evening was quiet except for the usual sounds of the countryside, the distant call of an owl and the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. When I reached the shed, I turned on my flashlight and shined it inside. Everything appeared to be exactly as I had left it. My lawnmowers were in their designated spots, my tools were hanging on their hooks, and nothing seemed to be missing or disturbed. I did a thorough inspection, looking for any signs of an animal or any indication of what might have caused the door to open. Finding nothing out of the ordinary, I closed the door firmly and made sure the latch was properly engaged. I even tested it a few times to make sure it wouldn't come open on its own. Satisfied that everything was secure, I began to walk back to my house. It was during this walk back that I began to feel uneasy. There was something in the air, some subtle change in the atmosphere that I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't anything I could see or hear, just a feeling that something was wrong, that I was not as alone as I should be on my own property. By the time I reached my front door, this feeling had grown stronger. I found myself looking over my shoulder and scanning the dark fields around my house, searching for any movement or sign of another person. I saw nothing, but the feeling persisted as I entered my house and locked the door behind me. I tried to shake off the uneasiness as I walked through my hallway, telling myself that the incident with the shed door had simply made me more alert than usual. But as I moved through my house, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. There was a muddy footprint on my hallway floor, clearly visible in the light-colored hardwood. I stared at the footprint, my mind racing as I tried to come up with an innocent explanation. But I knew it wasn't mine. I had cleaned my boots thoroughly before coming inside, as was my habit, and this print was from a different type of shoe entirely. It was larger than my foot, with a distinctive tread pattern that I didn't recognize. Following the trail of footprints, I discovered that they led from my front hallway all the way to my spare bedroom. The door to that room was closed, just as it always was, but I could see muddy traces on the floor leading right up to the threshold. My hands began to shake as I realized what this meant. Someone had been in my house. Someone might still be in my house. I stood outside the spare bedroom door, holding my rifle and trying to work up the courage to find out what was waiting for me on the other side. I could hear something now, a faint sound that might have been breathing. Someone was definitely in that room. I pressed my ear against the door and listened more carefully. The breathing was slow and deliberate, like someone trying to stay quiet but unable to completely control their respiration. Whoever was in there knew I was on the other side of the door, and they were waiting to see what I would do next. The door handle felt cold under my palm as I slowly turned it. I had to know who was in my house and what they wanted. I couldn't just stand there in my hallway all night, afraid to open a door in my own home. I took a deep breath, raised my rifle, and pushed the door open. The man inside my spare bedroom looked like he was about to attack me. He was holding a large metal shovel like a weapon, raised above his head and ready to strike. His face was twisted with an expression of pure rage, his eyes wild and unfocused. He looked like someone who had completely lost control of his rational mind. I shouted at him to stay back, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The rifle in my hands was the only thing preventing him from charging at me with that shovel, and I could see in his eyes that he was calculating whether he could reach me before I could fire. The tension in the room was electric, both of us poised for violence, both of us trying to decide what our next move would be. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at each other across my spare bedroom. I could see that he was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling rapidly as if he had been running or exerting himself physically. His clothes were dirty and disheveled, and there was something wild and desperate in his appearance that made him seem more like a cornered animal than a rational human being. I knew that calling the police would take too long. In my remote location, it would be at least an hour before any help could arrive, and I couldn't maintain this standoff for that length of time. Something had to give, and I was terrified that when it did, one of us might not survive. Suddenly, without warning, the man threw the shovel directly at me. I ducked as the heavy metal tool sailed over my head and crashed into the wall behind me. In the same instant, he turned and ran toward the bedroom window. I watched in shock as he crawled through the opening and disappeared into the darkness outside. I ran to the window and looked out, but he had already vanished into the vast empty fields that surrounded my property. There was no way to track him in the darkness, no way to know which direction he had gone or whether he might circle back to my house. He had escaped into the night, leaving me with nothing but questions and a lingering fear that he might return. The police arrived eventually and conducted a thorough investigation, but they found no clues about the man's identity or his motives. They theorized that he might have been hiding in my shed when I went out to close the door, then entered my house while I was distracted with securing the outbuilding. But they had no explanation for why he had chosen my house or what he had intended to do. The incident changed everything about how I lived in my retirement home. I installed a security system, reinforced my doors and windows, and began keeping my rifle loaded and easily accessible at all times. The peace and tranquility that I had sought in my rural retreat had been shattered by one terrifying encounter with a stranger whose motives remained completely unknown. Even now, years later, I still think about that night and wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been armed when I opened that bedroom door. The rage in that man's eyes was unlike anything I had ever seen, a fury that seemed directed at me personally even though we had never met. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there somewhere, and whether he remembers the house where his plans were interrupted by an old man with a rifle.